Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm taking a look at the Aorus FO27Q3, Gigabyte's take on a 27-inch 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED gaming monitor. There are many similarities here between this model and the MSI and Dell variants I looked at a few months back, as all three use the same Samsung display QD-OLED panel. But with the Gigabyte model coming in at an attractive $800 US price point, it's important to take a look to see what it offers. The design of the FO27Q3 is very similar to the FO32U2P we looked at a few weeks back, except scaled down to a 27-inch size. This 1440p model uses the same refreshed stand design with two metal prongs for legs, as well as the same central box design on the rear. The thin OLED display extends outwards from there, giving it a modern aesthetic fitting with the slimness of OLED panels. On the front we get slim bezels on three sides, along with the strip at the bottom featuring the Aorus logo. Gigabyte has chosen to use mostly plastic for the outer surfaces with grey metal legs. There's a few different textures used for the box on the rear, and generally I think the design looks decent. At the top is an RGB LED strip that includes the Aorus logo, along with some additional RGB LED highlights on the back. You're probably not going to see it anyway, as it is on the rear, which is usually hidden. Gigabyte has made a good effort to keep the legs relatively thin so you can still place items around the base of the monitor, and the overall stand is quite sturdy. It offers height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustment with an appropriate amount of height at its maximum. While the 4K 240Hz model stood out from the pack with its use of DisplayPort 2.1, the FO27Q3 uses a much more conventional set of ports, two HDMI 2.1 48 gigabits per second ports, one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, and a USB-C port supporting DP-Alt mode and 18 watts of power delivery. There's also a two-port USB 3.2 hub, allowing for KVM switch functionality. Both the HDMI and DisplayPort inputs allow you to run the display up to the maximum 360Hz refresh rate. The OSD on this monitor is controlled through a directional toggle and includes lots of features like separate display modes, lots of gaming specific features like crosshairs, shadow boosting, FPS counters and other information readouts, and a good amount of OLED care features as well. It's a fast and easy to navigate interface, which is always nice to see. As the FO27Q3 uses the same 3rd Gen QD-OLED panel as the MSI and Dell variants, its text quality is the same. The subpixel structure is enhanced relative to 1st Gen QD-OLED panels, but with a moderate 110 ppi pixel density, it doesn't have the same level of sharpness and clarity as 32-inch 4K panels at 140 ppi. Relative to a similar 27-inch 1440p LCD, this QD-OLED panel doesn't have as good text clarity. There is some pink-green fringing at the top and bottom of text due to the triangle RGB subpixel layout, and while this fringing is less noticeable than with 1st Gen panels, it's still not as good as equivalent LCDs. Typically though, it's reasonable enough for occasional desktop app usage and continues to be a non-issue for content consumption like gaming. However, compared to 27-inch 1440p WOLED panels, I think this QD-OLED panel produces better text clarity, with the fringing issue on QD-OLED less noticeable than the text shadowing on WOLED with its RWBG subpixel layout. For panel composition and coding, this is your classic Samsung QD-OLED panel experience, which is to say it's glossy with an anti-reflective surface treatment. The panel has the same issues described in previous QD-OLED reviews. In brighter environments where light sources are in front of the display, the panel has a tendency to reflect ambient light, raising blacks to the point where they appear somewhat grey. This impacts one of the key selling points to getting an OLED, which is its deep blacks. They just won't be that rich or deep in brighter conditions, especially relative to glossy WOLED panels. General reflection handling is decent, so mirror-like reflections aren't too bad, though being a glossy panel there is always going to be some amount of visible defined reflections which get worse the brighter the conditions are. However, the issues with the coding can be minimized by optimizing the placement of light sources in the room so that lights are behind the display. The darker the environment, such as gaming in a dim or fully dark room, the better this QD-OLED panel looks, and in dim conditions you will typically get a rich, deep OLED black experience. It's really hard to say whether this will be an issue for you, as it can be a case-by-case basis. Personally, I do find it annoying and one of the larger issues with QD-OLED panels, but if you primarily game at night, it's not anywhere near as much of a concern. At the very least, it's something to be aware of. With competing WOLED monitors though, most options use a matte anti-glare coating. It's a fairly heavy and effective coating that minimizes mirror reflections and better preserves blacks in brighter environments. However, the trade-off is grain. The matte WOLED coating is less clear than this glossy QD-OLED coating. The exception to this is the glossy Asus ROG Strix XG27AQ DMG, which combines the clarity of glossy with the deep blacks of WOLED. In my opinion, this glossy WOLED coating is much better than the glossy QD-OLED. What's also important to be aware of is that OLEDs generally aren't great monitors for desktop usage, productivity apps, and web browsing because they are susceptible to permanent burn-in, and these 360Hz QD-OLEDs are no exception. Anything with static content like toolbars or icons on screen for a long period of time, like you get with most desktop applications, is at risk of burning in. Conversely, dynamic content like gaming or watching videos, it's at practically no risk of burn-in, so don't worry about this if you're primarily using an OLED for gaming. Even the occasional bit of desktop app usage is fine, it's more 8 hours a day of productivity work that may lead to burn-in. As for burn-in warranty, Gigabyte are offering a 3-year warranty with their QD-OLEDs that covers burn-in as clearly stated on their website. This gives you some peace of mind that you should be able to use the display normally and not have to worry about burn-in, and if you do experience burn-in, you'll be able to file a warranty claim. With that said, we'd still recommend trying to minimize burn-in during usage, like minimizing the taskbar, setting the display to turn off after a short period of inactivity, and reducing static app usage. This should help extend the life of your monitor beyond the 3-year warranty period. Response time performance is excellent on this 1440p QD-OLED monitor, as it is for other OLED displays that we've tested so far. OLED offers lightning fast response times around the 0.25 millisecond mark at its maximum 360Hz refresh rate, and that leads to fantastic motion clarity. OLEDs also maintain the same performance at all refresh rates, so even when testing at 120 or 60Hz, we see similar results in the 0.3 millisecond range. This is a nice benefit for variable refresh rate gamers that results in a single overdrive mode experience. In contrast, many LCDs typically perform worse at lower refresh rates relative to their maximum refresh. The major limiting factor to OLED motion performance right now is the refresh rate itself. As a sample and hold monitor, OLEDs do still have some blur in fast motion scenes, and the level of blur depends on the refresh rate. At 360Hz, clarity is excellent, delivering a very fast experience for competitive gamers. But when running the display closer to 60Hz, clarity is reduced simply because the refresh rate is reduced, even though response time performance is basically identical at 360 and 60Hz. Still, having such fast response times gives OLED a noticeable advantage over a slower response time LCD running at the same refresh rate. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this QD-OLED and other OLED monitors, including WOLED variants. This means motion clarity is identical when the refresh rate is the same. However, OLEDs are much faster than even the fastest LCDs I've tested, and this is true whether we look at the best performance or average performance across the refresh rate range. Not only are OLEDs fast, they also have no overshoot artifacts, which can be an issue with some LCD models. When viewing cumulative deviation results, we can see that OLEDs get much closer to ideal response time behavior, and in most cases offer performance an order of magnitude better in this metric than LCDs. In practice, this leads to around a 1.5x advantage in clarity at a given refresh rate, so 360Hz QD-OLEDs like the FO27Q3 offer a similar experience to 540Hz LCDs. The only displays with clearly superior clarity are LCDs that offer elite backlight strobing, a feature that comes with its own set of limitations, like incompatibility with variable refresh rates and HDR. Input latency is excellent, offering a sub 0.5 millisecond processing delay in both the SDR and HDR modes. Combined with fast response times and a high refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use and is well suited to competitive multiplayer titles. There is no difference in latency between the Gigabyte MSI and Dell variants in any mode tested, even at a fixed 60Hz, where all three have between 6 and 8 milliseconds of processing lag. Power consumption is not any different to the MSI model. In fact, we're looking at basically the same result. The Dell model still ends up consuming slightly less power. This is still less efficient than competing 1440p WOLEDs though, which benefit from a white subpixel, and the best LCDs for efficiency will use less than half the power. Now, this display doesn't always use 70 watts. For example, opening Steam and showing the homepage of the store uses about 30 watts, as it's a much lower APL image, but that's still not as efficient as the best monitors, so yes, QD-OLEDs are power hungry. All QD-OLEDs that we've tested so far offer a very similar color space. In the case of the FO27Q3, we're looking at 99% DCI-P3 coverage, as well as 98% Adobe RGB coverage, strong results for viewing HDR content or working in those color spaces. In total, I saw 80.4% coverage of Rec 2020, which as you can see from the chart is basically the same as other QD-OLEDs that I've tested, and a higher color gamut than competing WOLEDs such as the XG27AQDMG from Asus. Out of the box factory calibration is okay when looking at grayscale, the CCT average is acceptable if a little red tinted, and the Delta E average is fine. Gamma suffers from a few accuracy issues. Like with a lot of gaming monitors, the SDR mode does not use an sRGB or Rec 709 gamut clamp by default, so a lot of content will be oversaturated as it gets expanded up to fill the very wide gamut of this monitor. Some people like this effect, although it's not especially accurate and can cause issues with skin tones in YouTube videos, for example. Factory grayscale performance is below that of the MSI and Dell variants, but not by a huge amount. Color checker performance is similar between the three due to oversaturation issues. Calibration can be improved through Gigabyte's included sRGB mode, however this mode locks you out of some settings, such as white balance. For grayscale, this mode is more accurate than the default configuration, and there's good gamut clamping, leading to much better saturation and color checker results. A Delta E ITP average below 5.0 across the board indicates a good level of factory calibration when using this mode. However, the competition is quite strong when it comes to sRGB configurations. The Gigabyte model is slightly less accurate than the MSI and Dell models for grayscale, though still very strong overall and clearly better than WOLED alternatives. For color checker, there's a more pronounced gap, with the Dell variant clearly ahead of the Gigabyte model. That's not to say the FO27Q3 is bad, just that its direct competitors offer outstanding calibration. Software calibration through CalMan can slightly improve results further, but this generally wouldn't be something I'd bother with on this monitor. I'd either use it in one of the wide gamut configurations if that's the experience you want, or switch it into the sRGB mode for sRGB work. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is practically identical to the other QD-OLED monitors I've tested. The Gigabyte model gets the closest to the MSI model, with the Dell variant slightly behind, but realistically most OLEDs at the moment cap out at around 250 nits. This is below the level of most LCDs, but sufficient for typical indoor use cases. Gigabyte disables automatic brightness limiters in the SDR mode, so there's no need for a uniform brightness setting, as brightness is always capped to around 255 nits. This prevents annoying behavior where the monitor gets brighter as you resize apps, and I prefer it to work this way. Minimum brightness of 20 nits also provides a good range for people that want to use it in a very dim room. I was very impressed with the viewing angles of this panel. They are very wide, which makes it easy to view the display even at quite extreme angles. It really looks excellent. This also means that there is a large sweet spot for viewing this QD-OLED, and you won't notice issues like the edges being slightly lower contrast or a bit washed out, which can be an issue with some flat LCD panels, particularly VAs. Uniformity was also very good, with my unit nice and uniform viewing full white and no dirty screen effect viewing dark greys. The Gigabyte Aorus FO27Q3 is well suited to HDR from a hardware perspective. OLED panels, including QD-OLED, directly emit light and have individual pixel control, which makes them ideal for displaying HDR content. This feature allows each pixel to independently vary from fully switching off to displaying bright highlights, giving us deep zero-level blacks and per-pixel local dimming. The level of control OLEDs provide minimizes blooming in high contrast scenarios and allows for clean distinction between bright and dark areas that are close together. Compared to LCDs with a multi-zone backlight, OLEDs have far fewer ugly illumination artifacts, which are most noticeable when displaying difficult scenarios like star fields or subtitles, and there are no zone transitions as bright objects move around the display. With per-pixel control as its main advantage, OLEDs are best at displaying high-contrast scenes with rich shadow detail, which is a key aspect to a good HDR presentation. Darker content interspersed with dazzling bright highlights brings out the best in OLED displays, as does HDR content with fast motion. For gamers especially, input latency on most OLEDs is low in the HDR mode. The weakness to the HDR presentation on an OLED is overall brightness. While peak brightness can be high in the best cases, full screen brightness is low, and this limits the punch in bright daytime scenes. LCDs may not have per-pixel control, but zoned backlights can simply get significantly brighter in bright scenes. Depending on what you want out of an HDR monitor, your preference could swing more towards LCDs or more towards OLEDs, but typically speaking, OLEDs are a great choice that deliver a fantastic HDR presentation. In terms of HDR configurations, the FO27Q3 is pretty much identical to the FO32U2P, where HDR performance is largely controlled through two settings, the HDR picture mode and the APL stabilize setting in the OLED care section. Depending on the combination you choose, you'll get different levels of accuracy and brightness. I think it's worth focusing on 3 of the configurations: the HDR mode with APL stabilize on middle, which is the default option, the HDR mode with APL stabilize on high, and the HDR game mode, which sets APL stabilize to high as well. The default HDR mode with the middle APL setting is equivalent to the true black mode we see from other QD-OLED gaming monitors. It has great EOTF tracking at all window sizes and no auto dimming in high APL scenes. However, overall brightness is capped at around 450 nits even for low APL content. This is the most accurate mode with the least brightness on offer. Remaining in the HDR mode but switching APL stabilize to high provides an experience equivalent to the Peak 1000 mode on other QD-OLEDs. Brightness now reaches 1000 nits in low APL scenes, and EOTF tracking is decent at 2 and 10% window sizes. However, at higher window sizes, which show performance in brighter scenes, EOTF tracking is much less accurate as the display dims above a certain average screen brightness. Then there's the HDR game mode. This mode is also capable of 1000 nits, but is overall much brighter than previous configurations. At small window sizes, EOTF tracking is bad and very inaccurate, but at larger window sizes and for the brighter portion of the curve, it more closely follows the expected curve and produces okay accuracy. Effectively, this mode tries to straddle the 2 previous modes. It doesn't limit brightness in dimmer scenes, giving you 1000 nits, but instead raises brightness, making lower APL content around 2 to 4 times brighter than it should be. Meanwhile, brighter content is pretty accurate and isn't dimmed like you'd see from the Peak 1000 type modes. None of these modes offer the best experience for HDR content. You'll still need to pick and choose what aspects you want to preference. When largely viewing brighter high APL scenes, the default HDR mode / true black mode is the best. When largely viewing dimmer lower APL scenes, the HDR plus high APL stabilized configuration / Peak 1000 mode is the best. The HDR game mode is great if you want to view brighter scenes accurately while boosting low APL brightness, but in my opinion, it isn't really a fix for the issues found in the other modes where either brightness is capped or the screen dims in bright scenes. My preference as a general choice, which has been the case for most QD-OLEDs, is the Peak 1000 configuration, which on this Gigabyte monitor is the HDR mode plus APL stabilize set to high, but I have heard from some of our viewers that they prefer the true black type configuration or even switching between the two depending on what they are viewing. Ideally, this would be resolved and the best aspects of the 2 main configurations combined into a single, universally good mode. In synthetic testing, there's no difference between full screen brightness across the various modes, which are all in the 250 to 280 nit range like other QD-OLEDs. Similarly, all can do 450 nits at 10%, which is in line with other QD-OLEDs. However, at a 2% window size, only the configurations which set the APL stabilize setting to high can reach 1000 nits. The default mode is capped to just 460 nits for the brightest elements. For other monitors, the most accurate mode that offers full panel brightness is being used in the chart. In our new real scene brightness testing, the results are also very similar to what we showed in the FO32U2 peer review. In this chart, the FO32U2 peer results are seen using the brightest, most accurate mode. 2 of the 3 tested FO27Q3 configurations do not dim the screen in brighter scenes. The default HDR configuration and the HDR game mode both were pretty accurate for higher APL content. However, the HDR mode with APL stabilized to high dimmed the screen to a significant degree, though this dimming wasn't quite as aggressive as the MSI model. In terms of peak brightness in a variety of scenes, it depends on the mode. For darker, lower APL content, the HDR mode with APL stabilize on high provided the highest brightness, reaching over 900 nits in multiple scenarios. The results here are generally pretty similar to the MSI 271QRX using the Peak 1000 nit mode. However, this mode is the dimmest for higher APL content. The default HDR mode and the HDR game mode are both brighter for higher APL content. The default mode, though, is capped to no more than 480 nits in any scene, which is pretty dim. The HDR game mode offers both good high APL brightness and decent low APL brightness, but suffers from terrible accuracy in dimmer scenes, over-brightening most of the image. It also doesn't get quite as bright as the HDR plus APL stabilized high configuration. None of these modes offer the ultimate experience, especially compared to the ASUS XG27AQ DMG, which uses a WOLED panel. Not only is this monitor brighter on average, it also doesn't dim the screen as aggressively for mid and high APL content. Peak brightness isn't quite as good from the Asus model as some configurations with the FO27Q3, but results are very strong in brighter scenes as far as OLEDs are concerned, and overall, I'd give the WOLED the clear advantage for brightness characteristics. This leaves me with mixed feelings about the Gigabyte model's brightness characteristics. I like that there are different configurations to suit different use cases and preferences, but ideally there should be just one mode offering all the benefits available across the different configurations. This seems to be an issue with QD-OLED monitors this generation. Here is an illustration of where the accuracy of each mode lies compared to other monitors. The HDR game mode is a significant outlier, while the default HDR mode is the most accurate configuration. Again, ideally there would be a single mode that does everything well. Finally, we have color volume. I'm moving to the newer ICTCP MDC metric here, which measures absolute color volume in millions of distinguishable colors instead of a volume relative to the display's max brightness. This metric is one that Dolby uses to determine a display's color volume and of course factors in both white and color luminance. As you can see, most QD-OLED monitors offer around 20 to 21 MDC, which is very high among modern displays as QD-OLEDs can produce a high peak brightness, a very wide gamut, and high color brightness. WOLEDs aren't as good comparatively, with lower color space coverage and much lower color brightness. What we're left with is total MDC for QD-OLEDs like the FO27Q3 around 36% higher than a WOLED like the Asus XG27AQDMG. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Part 1 assesses whether Gigabyte have done a good job advertising this monitor, and generally what they list on their website is accurate, including brightness numbers and factory calibration. Response time advertising, as always, isn't all that accurate. Meanwhile, in the feature support matrix, we see Gigabyte doing a number of things well. OLED performs very well for contrast and motion performance, and it's good to see inclusions like strong sRGB mode calibration, a KVM switch, user upgradable firmware, and built-in speakers. On the other hand, we're not getting adequate USB power delivery to charge most laptops or Dolby Vision support. Then there's the borderline results. Like with most OLEDs, there are times where OLED flickering is visible, though I believe this is rare and doesn't occur often in games. I also only think the monitor has good eOTF tracking at maximum brightness some of the time, as tracking at high APL isn't good in that mode. The monitor also has issues with HDR performance on AMD GPUs, which might be related to incorrectly reporting its maximum brightness to Windows, the same issue as the FO32U2P. Overall, the Gigabyte Aorus FO27Q3 is pretty much exactly what I expected. It's a version of the 27-inch 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED gaming monitors I tested earlier in the year, but with the tuning and configuration options seen in its 4K brother, the FO32U2P. This means that while there are some performance differences between the Gigabyte model and the previously reviewed MSI and Dell variants, most of the time all three models deliver a similar experience. That's great news for the most part, as this QD-OLED panel delivers excellent performance. It has elite motion clarity at 360Hz, similar to that of 500Hz LCDs, as well as very fast response times across the refresh rate range. While it isn't quite as clear as the best strobed LCDs at super high refresh rates, this latest wave of 360Hz QD-OLEDs offer the ultimate experience for competitive gamers that want speed but don't want to sacrifice adaptive sync, viewing angles, or resolution. This monitor also offers something for buyers that just want a visually stunning 1440p gaming display. You don't have to utilize the 360Hz refresh rate to benefit from deep blacks, per pixel local dimming, and a great HDR presentation with up to 1000 nits of peak brightness. This Gigabyte model is well calibrated from the factory, especially in its sRGB mode, and while it's not quite as good as the Alienware AW2725DF in this area, it's still among the best OLED monitors for accuracy. Not every aspect of this monitor is perfect, of course. OLED brings with it the risk of permanent burn-in, so it isn't well suited to lots of productivity work or static app usage. The subpixel structure at this pixel density isn't quite as clear for text as traditional LCDs, though it is a step above WOLED, and the panel composition and coding isn't the best for use in brighter environments either. When deciding upon which 1440p OLED monitor to get, there are two main questions to answer. Which QD-OLED variant is the best, and should you go QD-OLED or WOLED? There's not a lot separating the Gigabyte MSI and Dell 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED variants. The vast majority of performance characteristics are the same. The differences mostly come down to edge case features. For example, the MSI model is the only one with good USB-C power delivery, the Dell model has slightly better factory calibration, and the Gigabyte model comes with more HDR configurations. For most people, I don't think the differences are that significant. What ends up being the main point of difference then is the price. In the US, the Gigabyte and MSI models are the cheapest, both at $800 US, while the Alienware model is currently $830 US. Given the MSI model is often out of stock or hard to find, I think the Gigabyte model here is a great choice. Outside of the US though, the AW2725DF is usually substantially cheaper and clearly the best buy. For example, here in Australia, you can pick up the Alienware for 1,120 Aussie dollars, while the Gigabyte model is $1,500 and the MSI model is $1,700. It makes zero sense to pay a 30% premium to get the FO27Q3 over the AW2725DF. With that said, it's well worth considering the 1440p 240Hz glossy WOLED based Asus XG27AQ DMG instead. If you are primarily playing single-player titles and you wouldn't benefit from the higher QD-OLED refresh rate, the XG27AQ DMG features better HDR brightness, a superior glossy coating, and at least in the US, it's cheaper at $700 to $750 US. However, I'm yet to see pricing in other regions, and with the AW2725DF being so cheap, it might not be as competitive, so that's something to check out in your region. Anyway, that's it for this review of the Gigabyte Aorus FO27Q3, another 1440p QD-OLED monitor review, very similar to the MSI and Dell variants as I said, and if you want to learn more about those variants, the individual reviews of those models is probably going to reveal a lot more, as well as check out the XG27AQ DMG review, lots more thoughts about that equivalent WOLED, so yeah. Lots of OLED testing on the channel these days, as always. Anyway, thanks to everyone that supports the channel directly and our independent testing via our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. If you're interested in signing up, links are in the description below, and you'll gain access to some cool benefits like our Discord community, monthly live streams, BTS content, and all sorts of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.